I'm excited to welcome everybody to the second panel to commemorate the IMC's 20th anniversary. Our first panel, Independent Media, Where We've Come From and Why We Need It More Than Ever, with panelists Sarah Lazar, Tanya Parker, Sarah Meinrath, moderated by Danielle Chenoweth, is available on the UCIMC's Facebook page if you didn't get to hear it on September 30th. Welcome everybody. I am Shaya Robinson. I am a poet. I am a board member of the IMC, which I absolutely love. I'm going to be introducing some of our panelists today for our Abolition and Grassroots organizing event. The first will be State Representative Carol Ammons. She represents the 103rd District of Illinois and has a career in activist fighting for equality and justice. She is the first African-American woman elected to the 103rd District and is now the voice and advocate for her constituents in Champaign, Urbana. James Kilgore is formerly incarcerated activist, researcher, and author based in Urbana, Illinois. He has written 5 books, Understanding Mass Incarceration, A People's Guide to the Key Civil Rights Struggles of Our Time. He is also the director of Challenging E-Carceration Project of Media Justice, No Digital Prisons campaign. And Malkia Devich-Cyril is an activist, a writer, a public speaker on issues of digital rights, narrative power, Black liberation, and collective grief. And is also a founding executive director of Media Justice and is a senior fellow at the organization. So thank you guys for all being here. And I want to jump just straight into the questions. The first question will be to all of the panelists. I really want you to describe yourself because bios, I feel like, don't do justice in all of the hard work that you guys do. So if you can kind of introduce yourselves and the work that you do, and also what does abolition mean to you and how are grassroots activists moving towards abolishing? I will ask Malkia to go first.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really excited to celebrate, IMC and the work that you all have done over many, many years. Again, my name is Malkia Devich-Cyril. I am the founding director at what is now called Media Justice. But in general, I'm a media activist. I am the proud parent of 2 cats who definitely want to participate in this panel. So we're going to try to not have them participate. They have something to say though too. I'm a Panther Cub. My mother was a Black Panther, member of the Black Panther Party. My father was a member of the Black Liberation Army. I grew up amongst members of the party. My politics come from the Black Panther Party. And that's who I consider family. Let's see what else makes sense to say about me. I now am largely focused on, building and strengthening the movement for Black liberation, as well as organizing around the issue of collective grief. Now in a time of, mass death, more than ever, we need tools as a movement to navigate loss and grief. And I know this personally because I lost my wife 2 years ago. And that is part of why I left the organization. In terms of the question of what abolition means to me, I'd say that for me, abolition is about, understanding that slavery in this country never ended, it just changed form. And recognizing that, in this country, the economy and our state are all, they profit from the continued exploitation of Black bodies and Black people. But more than that, that slavery has structured how we live. Slavery has structured how our government is set up, how our economy is set up. And so really it hurts and affects everybody. Even those even the ruling class are chained by the history of slavery. And so abolition is really about transforming those conditions. It's about understanding that history. It's beyond the issue of ending prisons, although I think that's part of the fight, but it's really about transforming racial capitalism. It's about ending the relationship, ending the way that that the economy is stratified by race. And I think that that's the way I would think about and talk about abolition.
That's great. Thank you so much. Representative Ammons, can I get your opinion on that as well? In particular, what does abolition mean to you, and how are grassroots activists moving towards abolition?
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me on. And I'm very proud to say that I've probably been with IMC almost all 20 of those years. And so I could talk about a lot in relationship to that, and hopefully we'll get to that. But first and foremost, let me describe myself. I'm a mother of 3 absolutely fantastic children who are all adults now. My son will be 19 next week. I am the grandmother of 2 little children who love me unconditionally, and I'm grateful for that. I have a very bad dog and a fantastic husband, and I wouldn't trade any of them for anything. I am so honored to be in a community that has so many activists, so many people that actually give a shit. I'm sorry, I just literally care about what's happening to other people, and that means a lot to me. I am honored to represent the 103rd District. I consider myself an activist politician. I am assisting my colleagues in so many ways to see so many different angles of an issue. And it gives me great pleasure in order to provide just a little bit more relief for our communities that we serve. What abolition means to me is similar to what Malkia described. I just came from 2 of the most poor cities in the country, not just in the state of Illinois, but are on the top 10 list of the poorest communities in the country, Centerville and East St. Louis, both of which are the roots of Carol Ammons, where I come from. I visited my father this morning while I was there, who has suffered from generational poverty and racial capitalism his entire life. And even in those circumstances, he refuses to allow me, my sister, and my brothers to get him out of that community because his roots are there. And that's what means the most to him. And so abolition means to me to reverse the harm that capitalism has done to the entire globe. And that's a big task. And it's a never ending one, because with every generation, I feel that we are moving further and further away from a just society. And people in many ways can't see that. And so I find that to be my life's work. It is hard work. The political structure does not always welcome people like me, but I force my way into the right spaces to raise the right issues for the right reasons. And my goal is to get the right results. So the IMC is a critical part of that, has been a critical part of shaping, helping me grow. And many people on this call have helped to pour into me so that I can be the best servant that I can be for our community as well as for our nation, because ultimately we need more voices like mine in so many more places. So thank you for having me on, and thank you for hosting Shaya.
Thank you. James, can I also get you to give a little bit of a bio and explain what abolition means to you and how we're moving towards that?
Okay, thank you very much, Shaya. It's a pleasure to be here and to be on this panel with everyone. Very shared histories with them, so it's nice to come together here. Like Carol, I'm a proud parent and a recent grandparent. Like Carol, I also have a bad dog. Which I'll keep off of here, Max, so it doesn't get into a fight with your cats, and a wonderful partner. So I really came to abolition kind of the long route. I mean, I'm an old school activist from the 60s. 70s. I spent 27 years on the run from the federal law enforcement forces. But what was the most important part of that was that I spent 18 years of that in Southern Africa in the 1980s and early 1990s. And it was really there in the heat of a revolutionary struggle to overthrow colonialism and apartheid and racial capitalism in its form in that part of the world that I came to what we might call, what maybe we call abolition now, what we called liberation, revolution then, but it's all about transformation. It's all about dealing with the fact that the problems are systemic, and there's no one patchwork kind of repair that's going to make things better. So for me, when I finally was captured and spent 6.5 years in prison, I then learned kind of what mass incarceration was about by being inside and looking at the disproportionate amount of Black bodies, brown bodies, poor white bodies, people with disabilities coming through the gates. And one of the things that always sticks with me is that one of the people that I was doing time with got a sentence of 552 years plus 5 years of parole. So that kind of just captured for me what this system was trying to do to people. So when I came out, I landed in Champaign, Illinois. I was really a stranger in a strange land in the middle of the cornfields. And I had no idea how I was going to slot into this community. And then the sheriff did me a great favor. He came with a proposal to build a jail for $20 million in this county. And I said, hell no, you're not building a jail in this county after I just got done doing all that time. I'm going to find some people here that are going to fight that jail. And the first person that was ready to fight that jail was Carol Ammons and other people in Champaign, Urbana Citizens for Peace and Justice. So we then launched a campaign, which then became Build Programs, Not Jails, to resist the building of that jail. But out of that grew an abolitionist sentiment in the community. And out of that also grew another organization that I've become a part of, which is really near and dear to my heart. And that is First Followers, a reentry program that is made up of formerly incarcerated people. And I'm happy to see both Tiger Corbin and Ken Norton in the audience here to share these moments with us.
Hello. Walaikum salam.
Thank you, James. That's awesome. Thank you, everybody, for answering that first question. I want to circle back to Malkia. Can you talk about your 2002 Highlander Center in Tennessee gathering and how it played a big part of history between media justice movement and the IMC, and how that kind of shaped grassroots organizing?
Well, that is a big question, and I will do my best to answer it. Let me say that it definitely was not my gathering. You know, it was a gathering that was initiated by many organizers. I was one of them. Makani Temba was another, Nan Rubin, Mori. There was a number of people who participated in this gathering. And many of us were folks that were organizers, you know, in general, either racial justice organizers or worked in public television, community radio, you know, mostly media makers of various kinds. And, you know, we came together at the Highlander Center in 2002, number one, because Highlander has a reputation for bringing together movement leaders and being a place of strategy, you know, and a place of synergy. And so we thought, you know, we need to come together because at that time, you know, there was a movement, there was a sector, let's call it that. Well, I don't think it was a movement, called the media democracy. And people were, were concerned about the role and influence that corporations were having, the outsized role corporations were having on media. But many of the people who were working on this issue more visibly, many of the organizations that were being funded to work on this issue were being led by white men. They were in Washington, D.C. They were really focused on the Beltway. You know, they were fully focused on policy change as a strategy. And all over this country, there were community radio folks working in public TV, folks working on many different issues, and folks who weren't working on media technology as a primary issue, but who depended on media and or technology to win their primary issue, right? So it was a secondary issue for those folks. They were not involved in what was considered the media democracy movement, even though they, I think, make up the bulk of what was the media democracy movement. And that included folks working on independent media. And so, at that time, we said, you know what, we have to create space for our folks. We have to create a way forward for Black people, for Indigenous people, for Latinos, for our Asian folks, for our disabled communities, for our low-income communities, for our activists in cities and states across this country, not just folks working in the DC Beltway. And so we came together to have that conversation. We wanted to talk about what is the best way to make that happen. We also were in a period of intense, I'm sure you all remember, a period of intense, the Republican Party had really grown in power at that time, the 80s, 90s, right? We also saw, the crime bill. We saw that, and that wasn't the Republicans, that was Clinton and the Democrats, it's basically one party, two faces, and we saw the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which, really consolidated, a lot of the outlets that were available, particularly in radio. The point is, a lot was happening, to remove media and technology from the hands of the people. And so we came together at Highland in 2002, and we talked about it, and we walked away having coined the term media justice. And we coined the term media justice because we were borrowing from the environmental justice movement. It seemed similar to what we were going through, a movement that was reacting to a mostly white, mostly male, set of actors in the space, that were being funded at a high rate, while at the same time, poor people of color were the ones being affected by environmental abuse, and by climate change. And so it was the same kind of thing. We want to change those dynamics of power. Throughout history, since 2002, let me put it that way, since 2002, we've grown, as a movement. We've grown as a sector. There are now many, many organizations that identify with the movement for media justice. There are many, many organizations that are funded for their media justice work. And I'd like to think that the work that we did, those founding folks had a lot to do with that. We didn't just try to build an organization, the Center for Media Justice or the Media Action Grassroots Network. We tried to build a sector. We tried to initiate new pools of money. We tried to help launch new organizations. We tried to bring leaders together. We tried to move policies that in the past, our people had not had a voice on before. So it was a multifaceted, multi-dimensional strategy that we were attempting to move. And I think I'll just close with the last piece of this question, which is around this question of abolition and how grassroots activists have been involved. So first of all, let me just say this. UCIMC has been involved in almost every victory that the movement for media justice has accomplished, okay? Because that's how much of a leader this organization is in this city, in this state. When we were working to reduce the cost of calls from prison, UCIMC was a leader in that fight, winning at the state level, winning, right, constantly winning, and providing leadership, I think, to the national movement. When we worked to help protect public and community radio, IMC was front and center. UCIMC was front and center on that fight, leading that fight, as we won together net neutrality. once again, you know, a leader in that fight. So, you know, whether it's a state fight, a local fight, or a federal fight, you know, the organization has been front and center helping to lead the way. We've protected broadband access through Lifeline. You know, we've won state laws protecting broadband security. We've taken on some of the largest companies in the country and certainly in the world, you know, taken on Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, Microsoft, Palantir. You know, these companies that are controlling people's lives on a daily basis. Poor people, Black people, Indigenous folks, our people are taking these companies on. That is how I believe, you know, we are beginning to understand that abolition has not, let me say it differently. Working for abolition in a digital age isn't really that different from working for abolition under slavery. Okay, I mean, there are huge differences in terms of the risk to your life, but only if you're outside of prison. See, if you're inside of prison, I don't actually think that the conditions are that distinct, personally, you know. So for those of us who are outside of the bars, you know, we being able to understand that the economy has changed, that we live in a global digital economy, and that economy has changed the way policing happens. It's changed the way profiling and surveillance happens. It's changed the way punishment happens. It's put the burden of punishment on communities. For example, it's making us pay, you know, for our own incarceration. It's incarcerating us in our homes, you know, putting towers in our communities to surveil us on a daily, regular basis. All of these tools, all of this police tech, this is part of this global digital economy that has emerged. And we are fighting that. All over the country, organizations are fighting that. In Detroit, you know, in Chicago, in Oakland, you know, banning facial recognition, you know, on every level, we are trying to push back on the police state that has grown. And we're not only dealing with the state, because we also understand this is an economic problem as much as it is a political problem. And so we're doing both, on both fronts, taking on the corporations, taking on the policies, and transforming the conditions for our people to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we're gonna go into Carol Ammons. Can you talk about your time during the period that you were at the IMC and how that work around the community and social justice was?
Thank you. Wow, everything that Malkia just named, you know, sometimes when you are working, you forget about how much work you've done. I mean, you know, just so many campaigns, so much time that we've dedicated to the issue of empowerment, but also challenging the status quo. When the IMC initially was at the storefront on Main Street in Urbana, I remember walking into the door not knowing what an IMC was. I didn't know what it was. I came from Chicago and I didn't know nothing about no IMC. I was on the South Side, right? And so we walked into the door and there was a woman in there that was on the floor working on some signs. And I said, well, what are you doing? And she says, well, we are trying to do some signs to protest, at that point, the county jail. Isn't that interesting? As a matter of fact, it wasn't the county jail. It was the prison phone contract. That's what it was. That was the first thing. And me and Aaron, we said, oh, okay, so like, tell me about that. So they did. And I said, man, that's not right. So we joined Sandra Otten and Danielle and several other people that were there at that time sitting on the floor making signs so that they could protest the phone justice issue. And this is a decade almost before we could originally eradicate at the state level the exploitative contract on the prison phones. So this is the precursor to Carol Ammons going to Springfield and passing the bill to eliminate the kickbacks at the state level and lower the cost. But in between that moment, all the way until that bill passed, was a whole host of people that many are on this phone call. Every campaign that we worked on, whether it was criminal justice reform at the courthouse here locally, environmental justice with Ken Salo, who I didn't even know the term environmental justice. I had no idea what that meant. I just thought Black people grew up in neighborhoods that were just shitty. And I didn't know what that was. I didn't have a term called environmental justice. But we remember organizing marches and demonstrations from the IMC that we set up to do unity marches through the hood so that we can identify, as Ken taught us, all of the points that were considered environmental injustices in our neighborhood that we just thought it was supposed to be like that. I remember going to meet Malkia for the first time. Me and Danielle traveled together to meet Malkia and CMJ and work on net neutrality. I had no idea what the term net neutrality was. I was not in media justice, so I had no idea. Along the way, I have been simply a good student, and I have learned how all of these things impact the lives of people when they cannot put a word to it, they don't have a definition of what this thing is that's dictating the outcomes of their lives. I remember us hosting network sessions and teaching organizing to youth in our community at the IMC. I learned about what coding was before they decided coding was popular enough to teach the rest of us from the IMC. All of the projects that we've hosted over the almost 2 decades that I've been involved with the IMC were really developed to empower the community and to teach them how to take power in situations where others want you to be powerless. And that has been the incubation of the IMC, how we tied race and technology together, where Black people had no access to internet. The IMC led on the contract to get the broadband into Champaign, Urbana, so that we can connect people's homes at a rate that they can actually afford to have internet in their homes. And God, can we imagine today what it would look like? And I know what it looks like in communities outside of Champaign, Urbana, whose children got to do school online today, and they don't have access to the internet. I remember the raising of the tower of WRFU radio at the IMC. All of this is at the IMC. I had never seen a radio tower, less known seeing somebody put one up, right? Because our communities weren't engaged in that. And now, because we don't have the only Black radio station that was here when I came to Champaign, Urbana, has since closed. All we have now is the IMC, whose tower is still up. That's how much work has been done in what the IMC. I know the IMC has stepped in for community churches, Black churches that don't have buildings and needed a place to meet, and to provide the space for Black churches to do that at the IMC. I've seen Black community organizations trying to get off the ground, and the first place that I will tell them to stop in is the Independent Media Center, because there's no hub outside of there that provides space and resources and tools for people to be able to launch their small business or launch their community-based organization or their art project that we hosted. I don't even know how many art sessions that we've hosted as a result of having the IMC. See, to me, the IMC represents the microcosm of what government actually is supposed to do for its citizens. It's supposed to be the baseline, the safety net that allows you to take an idea and make your citizenship, if that's what they want to call it, mean something, that I can enact what it means to be a full human being in this space. It provides the context, the safety net for that to happen. It removes this idea of we are all separate because we don't come from the same place. It removes all of that. We met at the IMC, CUCPJ met at the IMC for almost 15 years. Every Saturday, we were at the IMC from 4 to 6, and we had no money. By the way, we passed the hat so that we could cover the small costs that would be necessary so the IMC could keep the lights on. But we met there religiously, as a cult would meet for its religious organization. CUCPJ met there religiously so that we could be a base again for community people who were having problems with the police, with the schools, with every other institution that impacts the lives of people. We met there. We met there when we saw what happened to Patrick Thompson and Martell Miller and so many other people who were fighting the criminal justice system. That was our staging post. And it has been that for so many people. I mean, I have so much that I could talk about the IMC, but it has radicalized so many people just by being a hub of activism where we could meet and discuss ideas that are taboo in some way, that we can be honest about the racial impacts that we all grow up in, that people have biases that they've never confronted, but we confronted them at the IMC, internally and externally. We talked unapologetically, we talked unashamedly about the things that were harming us and harming our communities. We talked about developing strategies. We were problem makers and problem solvers for elected officials in this state as well as others. We went together. Malkia, Danielle, and several of us traveled to Washington, D.C. to confront them about net neutrality and why we could not allow these conglomerates to control the internet. And here we are, 5, 6, 7 years later, fighting these same people. Now our communities are dependent on the internet. And many children today will not receive a good education because we never put the infrastructure into their communities so that they could even do school today. IMC was ahead of its time. Its leadership had vision and understood how important the work at the IMC in organizing and developing organizers, right? Because I'm not at the IMC every day doesn't mean the organizing stops or that someone else doesn't come along and continue the work that we need to do for our communities. The mission and goals of the IMC, I think, are as strong today as they were yesterday, 5 years ago, and even 10 years ago. The mission of the IMC has to continue regardless of how many of us are on this call are there every day. And so I'm inspired that there's been 20 years of service that the IMC has given to this community. And even when the city council tried to hinder us, when I was the director of the IMC, we marched our tails across the street and challenged the city council to make sure that the IMC was protected as an institution in this community. And I'll continue to do that no matter where I am. It has been my greatest pleasure to be a state representative that could say, you know what? We have community-based organizations that we can fund. For the first time in my political career, I participated in a capital program at the state level that I could then give money to the IMC to help it continue its mission. That was the greatest privilege that I have had as a legislator, to then say all of this work that we've done as group collectively, as organizers and activists, all of that work solidified itself in passing prison phone justice. The first and the strongest in the country came out of Illinois because we did that work collectively together. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of net neutrality. I'm proud of criminal justice reform. And guess what? We haven't stopped that. We're gonna continue pushing it. I'm proud of being able to move my colleagues as far left as humanly possible. And when they don't vote the right way, I'm proud to call them out. So this is the work that we have done and what I have learned as a student of the IMC. And I'll just say in closing to the senior Belden Fields, who also taught me that this is about human rights, because we can move from issue to issue to issue to issue to issue. But what I have learned is that human rights allow us to put it under one umbrella and say, if it does not fit under here, if we don't find and provide for people their rights as human beings, then our work is not done. And so I am simply a student of the Independent Media Center and all of these great doctors and philosophers. We know who you all are on this call, and all the work that you all do to infuse in me and infuse in us the level of responsibility that we have as members of this community. And I'm proud, I'm further proud that I have imparted that same thing because of many of you into my own children. And I wanted them to be public servants in the same way that their parents are demonstrating to them that they have to care about more than themselves. And that's what the IMC represents for me. So thank you all so much for allowing me to help commemorate the 20 years of the Independent Media Center.
Thank you for that, Carol. I also love the IMC and all of the amazing work that you guys have done and all the amazing people that I've met at the IMC. James, can you talk about, speaking of the IMC, can you talk about your work at the IMC and how it ties into electronic monitoring and some of the programs that have kind of come up under the IMC?
James, you're muted. Let's see, if you click that lower left-hand corner.
Okay. Sorry. When I first landed in Champaign, I was on parole. And I was kind of scared to poke my head out the door for fear they would come and grab me and take me back to prison. So I kind of laid low for a while. But at a certain point, I decided I can't keep laying low forever. I've got to get out and do something. I've got to do something to fight this monster of mass incarceration and this structural racism that's everywhere. So the very first thing I did politically was to organize a reading group of The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And guess where that was held? Right here at the IMC. So, and I know there's a number of people who are on this call who were part of that reading group. And I also remember there was a baby in that reading group that as I was facilitating, I used to hold that baby here so the baby's mother could participate more fully in the group. And that was Ezra, who's now a little bit more than a baby. So that was kind of my first introduction to the IMC, to find that here's a space and where things happen in weird ways, right? It's not like there's this tight structure and everything is going to happen. There's going to be a program every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 to 11, another program from 11 to 12. There's a kind of creative chaos which sometimes drives us nuts, but which is also a spark for new ideas and new ways of doing things. So for me, I think two things grew out of that initial reading group. We had a second reading group, but what really came out of that reading group was the whole fight against the jail. Because by the time everybody read Michelle Alexander's book, they were ready to kick ass on anybody that wanted to build a jail in Champaign. And lo and behold, here came the sheriff and Julia Reitz, our state's attorney, with a nice proposal to build a jail, and we were ready to go. And Carol was still on the county board then, so she was standing up and fighting. And then every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, there'd be Carol, me, maybe Chris Evans, maybe Jeremy Bamberger, maybe a whole selection of other people. Ken Salo would come, and we'd have these meetings, and we did this for years, fighting against the jail. And that grew the idea of, well, if we're not going to build a jail, let's look for something better to spend that $20 million on. And out of that came the idea, working with Aaron now as well, and Marlon Mitchell, the director and founder of First Followers, we came up with the idea of an organization of formerly incarcerated people to fight for access to resources to assist people coming home. So it was out of that initial reading group and the struggle against the jail that the idea came to put together First Followers. So that's a whole thread of history and we're still fighting that jail. Actually, we know they still keep trying to throw it out there. It hasn't even been a year since we came back and had to push back again against a proposal to build that jail. The other thread that came out of that for me was, as we were looking at the jail and looking at so-called alternatives to incarceration, when I came out, part of the reason I wasn't active was because they slapped this shackle on my ankle, this ankle monitor, and they told me when I first landed that I could only go out of the house from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday. That was it. And my parole agent told me I should be able to take care of all my business by 10 o'clock in the morning every day. So I'd get up at 5 every day so I could get my 4 hours out walking around the streets and then come back in the house. But as I went through that experience, I said, hey, guess what? This technology is dangerous. And people would say, what are you worried about? It's better than prison. It's better than jail. And I said, that's not the issue. The issue is they're going to take this stuff and they're going to slap it on people. And we know who they're going to slap it on. They're going to slap it on the same people they've been putting in prison. Black people, immigrants, the same targets. So I went around, I interviewed people that had been on the monitor, and then I put together a report with the support of people at the IMC, put together a report about electronic monitoring. And Danielle then was working for Media Justice, and she said, let's see if we can get Media Justice to put this report up on their website, and then maybe people will read it and you can connect up with other people that are dealing with that issue. So that's exactly what happened. Malkia was very, very supportive of dealing with this whole issue. The report went up. A lot of people read it. We ended up making a network out of that, putting together a couple of convenings around the issue of electronic monitoring. And then I was fortunate enough to get the support once again of the IMC and Media Justice to apply for a Soros Justice Fellowship and do a much bigger campaign on electronic monitoring, which then ended up historically in 2019 with a bill in the Illinois state legislature to ban the use of electronic monitoring for people coming out of prison, the first such bill anywhere in the country. And we know who sponsored that bill, Carol Ammons from the IMC, right? So these threads of history keep going forward. So we actually managed to pass that bill in the House, and then COVID shut it down in the Senate. So we're still thinking about that. But that's just all some of the threads of how things grow from the IMC. And they seem insignificant. As Carol said, you don't even recognize necessarily at the time that what you're doing is important. But as you look back, you kind of follow these historical threads, these steps, and all of a sudden those little early morning meetings turn into something much bigger and more important.
Shaya, if I can say that James, the work that James did on electronic monitoring, the report was so critical that even today, as I sit on the Supreme Court Commission for Pretrial Services, I sent that report to all of the chief judges of the Supreme Court for Illinois, so that they who are working on pretrial will not fall back on electronic monitoring as the solution for pretrial services. And I challenged them, and these are the justices of Illinois, and I asked them, I said, if a person is innocent until proven guilty, then how can you make them guilty before proving them guilty? By putting electronic monitoring on them. And so that work is still circulating, that CMJ helped us to pay for so that we could get the report out. And then that report has again made its way all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court.
It's beautiful to see the connections between the IMC and other organizations and how the work has spread kind of further than just Champaign-Urbana or even just Illinois, but seeing this work really be solidified across different places and people knowing what the IMC is really cool. We have 2 more questions and then we'll get to audience questions. So I want the audience to be thinking of questions that we can ask our panelists. This question is for everybody. Can you describe how media, in particular indie media, plays a role in grassroots organizing in local communities, and how do people support those movements? I will start with Malkia.
Well, you know, I think we all know that, you know, Black communities have been hyper-criminalized in mainstream news, but also in popular television. We know that, you know, similarly, Latino migrants, Latinos in general, and specifically immigrant communities, you know, and all manner of folks, but you know, indigenous folks, Asian folks, in various ways, have either been erased or have been exposed through hypercriminality when it comes to what we read, watch, and listen to in mainstream media. And as that happens, you know, in this construction of an enemy, you know, this construction of a terrorist, this construction of those who do and don't belong, you know, the only way that we have, or one of the primary ways that we have found as a movement to counter, you know, that narrative, to counter those dominant narratives, are to create our own vehicles for voice. And so that, to me, is the role that independent media, you know, has played. And not just independent, I mean, you know, independent, community, and public, right? That all of these efforts to take hold of our own voice are part of that struggle and that strategy. I would actually add, the fight for net neutrality is a fight for independent media, you know? The fight for community broadband is a fight for independent media. All of these paths of struggle create an opportunity for us to control our own voices. And community control of our voices is what we're after, you know? And so I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Yeah. Carol, if you can also answer that question, please.
I learn so much from Malkia every time I hear her. I just really appreciate what CMJ has done, because one of the things that Malkia just pointed out is this whole fight is for us to be able to control our own narratives and our own voices. The fact that we are having to fight this is the story in itself. You know, I know this firsthand as an elected official. I fight with the media here constantly, literally. I fight with the media here constantly. I remember just a few weeks ago, I won't call his name, but so-called editor of the local Yokel paper, you know, sent me an email some weeks back, and his condescending tone and racial overtures was so obvious that my response to him was that when you hire a Black reporter and diversify your editorial board, then you call me. Otherwise, I will not do an interview at all with your paper. And so I don't care if they write whatever they write about me. At this point, it is not in my best interest to grovel, which they like you to do, to beg, to try to explain away their racism. I refuse to engage with them on it. And I think for us, we have to start pushing back and, like you said, making our own media and making our own stories. If I've learned anything from the indie media moment and movement, it is that you get an opportunity to tell your own stories. And because of the way that media works, and we are learning that, right? That video camera on my cell phone is as important as that crap that they write in that newspaper. I'm able to tell my own stories. I'm able to control the narrative, and I'm able to select who I will engage with as it comes to media. And so the voice, WRFU, WEFT, the Public Eye, Democracy Now!, they become the reliable sources. The commercialized media becomes less and less reliable because they've turned into tabloids and capitalist sounding boards for ridiculousness. And so I've chosen deliberately not to engage with them. And when I do engage with them, it's on my terms. And I think that is what I have gotten from indie media. That is what I have gotten from the Public Eye. If I want the actual story, I'm not going to go to the local yokel paper for that, right? That's not where the story is going to be. I have to do the research outside of this corporatized, racialized media organizations that have emerged to attempt to demonize Black people, demonize Black elected officials like myself and my husband. They spend a lot of time trying to do that, but we decided that we will control our own narrative and they won't make slaves out of us. And I think that is the biggest part of this whole process. And even if we decide to engage, it will be on our own terms. One thing I have learned from history is that history records things the way the victor decided they were going to be. Doesn't mean that it's the truth. And so for us, we don't have enough time or money to get them to run our truth. And that's why I engage with the Independent Media Center. I engage with Democracy Now! I engage with XM radio hosts that are Progressive Radio News. See, we get an opportunity to choose. And when I get an opportunity to choose, that is what I choose to do. So construction of an enemy, I'm gonna use that, Malkia, because the media has done that to Black people since the first day that the enslaved stepped off of the enslaver's ship. And we have been fighting our own stories ever since. I don't think we should ever give that up and allow them to control the narrative. So something I will do, in as long as the people of the 103rd send me back, my goal is to not only draw down those local yokel kind of papers, but those misrepresentations should not be funded by the taxpayers of our community. So I am not going to fund this newspaper. I was finna cuss. I ain't gonna fund this newspaper with my tax dollars so that they can paint Black people as the enemy in Champaign County. So my goal is to disrupt that process and disrupt their work. So that's how I see indie media and the important role that it plays.
Thank you for that, Carol. James?
So I think I share Carol's fancy word, antipathy for the local yokel newspaper, having suffered a fairly aggressive attack by them in 2014, which almost cost me my employment and certainly caused myself and my family a lot of trauma. It became clear that there was no way to use that media to counter what the slanders that they were putting in there. So I refused, like Carol said, I refused to talk to them, tried to look for other spaces to construct a counter narrative. So I think maybe this, and I'm going to make just a slight critique here, is that I think, community media needs to also be ready, needs to have a strategy to defend people who are under attack. That's going to happen more and more, and we have to not only create the counter narratives, but be able to use that information in those stories effectively. I think a couple of the things that I learned from IMC and from media justice is how to use people's stories as political power. And that's another thing we don't always do as well as we could. But for example, in CUCPJ, every week we had a narrative from Barbara Kessel, who's on this call, as a court watcher about what was happening in all these cases in court. We had the details of how the courts were operating, how they were abusing people, particularly how racialized the justice was in Champaign County. We had a front row seat in the courtroom every week. And this was powerful. And I think it's helped empower people, but we could have made much stronger use of those stories to develop our counter narrative. Excuse me. In the state legislature, when we were fighting for the bill with Carol, we had a subject matter hearing. And when we came to the subject matter hearing, we had a lawyer who was chairing that subject matter hearing, and it was obvious he knew absolutely nothing about electronic monitoring. And we had lawyers talking about electronic monitoring, and I could just see it sailing right over his head. And then we had a mother whose son was on electronic monitor who came into the hearing, and she said, excuse me, my son was on electronic monitoring, and he was shot, and I couldn't get him out of the house to get him to the doctor. And as a mother, I had to do that, take him down to the doctor and risk sending him back to prison rather than have him suffer the consequences of this infection. And then she reaches down onto the floor and she brings out the box for her son's electronic monitor. She says, I've come here today to give you your box back. Here, take it. I'm done with this technology. Well, that lawyer, chairperson of that committee, from that point on, he was an advocate. He was a chief sponsor of that bill. It was that story of somebody who was directly impacted that it affected him. Not all the legalese and the constitutional amendments and all that kind of stuff, but the concrete experience of people feeling the impact of that technology. So I think that's the power of grassroots media, is to use those stories and to constantly be thinking, how do we convert those stories into political power, into power for the people who carry those stories, and into the power of the people who collectively carry those stories as they move forward.
Thank you for that, James. That's awesome. So we have one final question before we get to audience questions. What advice do panelists have in this moment just before the elections? How can the stories and history we talked about today kind of sustain our grassroots organizing in the months ahead? And I'll go to Malkia for this one.
You know, I'm a big believer in public narrative. And I think that actually right now, I think we need to turn to poetry. I think we need to turn to music, art. I think that we're living in a time of great loss, of great threat, and that people are terribly afraid, and they have good reason to be. And so I think that really turning our attention to the cultural works that will sustain us and help us thrive and give us the opportunity to build the strategies that we need from a place of deep centeredness and a place of deep groundedness. I think that's one of the things that I believe in and that I hope happens. I also think that we need to lift up, you know, this is a time to really lift up our community media stations and our public media and become members of these outlets. And you know, you get what you pay for. Let's be real. So if these outlets have no funding streams, then you are going to be relying on, you know, CNN, which is fine, I guess, on one level, but they're not telling your story. You know, they'll tell you, you might can rely on them to tell you about the big, you know, the election or about this and that. But what happens when you get to the polls and there's a bunch of voter suppression happening, who's going to tell that story in your neighborhood, at your polling precinct? That's you. And so, and so we need to ensure that the outlets that we are relying on in our local communities, that they have the support that they need to tell the stories that need to be told. I would say lastly, you know, we only get through things together. You know, this is an important moment. You know, we've put forward, you know, recovery bills, COVID recovery bills. They haven't been passed by the Senate. They've been passed by the House. And, you know, many, you know, hundreds, 870,000 people applied for unemployment last week. You know, people are suffering at an extraordinary rate today in our country, and so I think that we need to step up our mutual aid efforts. We need to think about how we bring mutual aid to scale. And I don't mean to scale as in like really big projects. I mean, how do we connect the small projects that are happening in cities across this country so that we can do what in fact the state has failed to do, to take care of our people.
Thank you for that. Carol?
Okay, wow. There are just so many barriers that need bridges built for them. Commitment to action, you know, with a focus on building relationships and addressing tasks that will help other people. I know sometimes fear and frustration and fatigue can just weigh on us and weigh us down sometimes. But we have to wrap ourselves around each other at a time like this. You know, I am reminded of something that Senator Sanders, engagement between Senator Sanders and Joe Biden on the presidential Democratic debate. And Joe Biden said to Sanders, he said, you know, Bernie, you know, people don't want revolution, he says. And I don't think I'll ever forget that. The people actually do need a revolution. What we are experiencing right now, it's so anonymous with is this whole thing about keeping poor people poor, unhealthy people unhealthy, housing stock poor. You know, it's so much the system that has been built that actually needs to be revolutionized. And people decided to revolt after the killing of George Floyd around the world. And if that's not a sign to those who are in higher positions and power, if that's not a sign to them that the slightest infraction at this point could just literally send us into a civil war, I don't know what else they need to determine what the moment is that we're living in. So all of us are at risk. Everybody is at risk in this moment. And it's important for us to fight for systemic change. That's important, because if we don't do it, those who might be comfortable today won't be comfortable tomorrow. The media asked me recently, a Fox interview, and she said to me, she says, you know, Representative, I don't want to politicize it in a way, but wouldn't you say that it's not a good thing for people to turn to violence in order to be heard? Shouldn't it be peaceful protests? And I said to her, I said, it should be peaceful protests, but the level of injustice is at a state that people are at their highest frustration point. And just like America's founding was not peaceful, the revolution, unfortunately, will not be peaceful because the injustice is not peaceful. It is not peaceful to watch people sleep on the streets of America or be hungry or live in a hovel like my father is today. That's not peaceful. And so it should disturb us all. And yes, the capitalists are going to have some pain for them to see that it is not just for them to own all of the wealth of the country. That's not justice. That is not peaceful. And so for us to ask the community to respond in a way that is demobilizing to them, that they cannot exercise their frustrations in the way that they see best, because the injustice is so high. It is a crime for us to see people suffering in the way they are. The state of Illinois, is giving more money away with less red tape to big companies and business owners than they are with people who are simply trying to get their unemployment. And that is not peaceful. So it is going to require us to be a little uncomfortable. And sometimes that does mean 1968 riots and burning of buildings that happened in Oakland and St. Louis. Yes, it is going to require us to see an unpeaceful protest in order for people to get it at the top. And unfortunately, that is where we are. And so the independent media, as James said, is going to have to defend people like me, because I am indeed on the front lines in a space that people are comfortable and people are not willing to take any real risk when it comes to dismantling systemic racism. That is not a job that everybody can do. And so when people are silent, when they attack your leaders, people like me won't last very long. So we need indie media to step up, and we need indie media to tell the stories of those who are not peaceful in their protests. Thank you so much. I apologize, I'm sorry.
No, thank you for that, Carol. That was beautiful. James, if you can answer this last question, and then we will go to audience questions.
I want to talk a little bit about white privilege at this moment, because if we look at the history of uprisings, if we look at the history when particularly Black movements have become more and more powerful, at critical moments, there's been a lot of times in which predominantly white movements have regressed, have stepped back, have held back when the confrontation that moment. And so I think there needs to be a constant awareness, particularly amongst white activists, that a lot of times the reality that you live is not the reality for Black and brown people and other oppressed people in this country. And I want to give a very simple example, a local example, because I think we need to apply these examples locally. Right now, we have an epidemic of gun violence going on in Champaign. We have young men, primarily young Black men, every week, sometimes 2-3 times a week, young Black men are getting killed by gunfire. And why is that happening? It's because of all the structural things that everybody's been talking about. It's because they're living in those hovels that Carol is talking about, that there's no jobs, there's no education, there's no opportunities there. And there's no response either from official sources like the city councils, or there's not a lot of response on the ground from progressives, white progressives in the community around this particular issue, because it happens over there. It happens in the North End. So I want us to just be mindful of this as we move forward, that there's a lot of different realities that happen, and the realities that a lot of white activists face are much more comfortable realities than what's happening in many other parts of the community. The the second point I want to make is that don't expect a fascist to act like a rational Republican politician. Don't wait for them to believe in the structures of the Constitution, in the legislative processes. Don't wait for them to discover that they misunderstood. They're not misunderstanding anything. We're misunderstanding if we think they're misunderstanding. They are prepared to take over the state house in Michigan, right? They're prepared to do a whole lot of things. And we sit in this kind of bubble in Champaign County, but remember that we are also surrounded by counties that voted for Trump, right? So just keep that reality in mind. And then the third point I want to make is that let's hope that the election results are positive as they can be, but whatever struggle we're engaged in, whatever abolition we're fighting for, it's not going to end on November 4th. It's going to begin on November 4th. So we just have to keep that in mind. We can't relax and allow the far right, the fascists, to regroup and counterattack.
Thank you so much for that, James. We will hop into audience questions, and there's one from Ken Salo. Can you share more about community-led campaigns for racially oppressed low-income families to freely access high-speed internet for education? We'll bump it to anybody who wants to answer. Yeah, go Carol, thank you.
I know the school districts are providing the tools, right? The hard tools, but the internet is still the problem, right? In many of our spaces, we don't have reliable internet that is operational for the children, but there hasn't been a campaign that I'm aware of here locally that has built around pushing the cities to help to increase the high-speed internet access for education. There's been many, many dollars sent to the state level, to the local levels from the state to do this thing, but then at the same time, they get an opportunity to design how that's going to work, which is always part of the problem. So those who are in charge at the local level need to be challenged to provide internet access hotspots in the community where the internet is not as reliable. And two, one of the parents, she wrote me on Messenger and she said, the school district gave them a computer, but she has 3 children. They can't all be on at the same time for their classwork. So how are they supposed to do that? This virtual educational moment does not work. It simply doesn't work. We are sitting in Champaign-Urbana, and I sent this to the University of Illinois, who has testing available every 2 days for everybody associated with the University of Illinois, faculty, researchers, staff, and students right here in the center of our community. It doesn't make sense that our 2 school districts, Unit 4 and Unit 116, cannot utilize the effective research and testing that the University of Illinois has pioneered to open our schools and test those children and those faculty and those staff members every 2 days, like we're doing at the University of Illinois. So money has everything to do with this. Somebody mentioned earlier, I don't know if it was Malkia or James, that this is an economic problem, has always been an economic problem, and poor people, and certainly Black people, haven't moved one iota when it comes to the massing of resources to offset these kind of things. And so we are wholly dependent on the agency of the state and the local governments. And if the local governments haven't even spoken to this issue at all, that means that we need new local elected officials. So some of those activists that are on this call, it might be time for us to take up that mantle and to become the officials that will direct the resources in a way that makes sense. The city of Urbana, to spend $300,000 on a police contract for SROs when the schools aren't even open, should outrage every single person on this call. The city of Urbana, that's supposed to be a liberal bastion in this community, rather spend $300,000. They could put up towers for people in the East Urbana who can't get online. But no, they decided to spend $300,000 on an SRO contract when we don't even have school. That harkens me back to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And the results will be equally as devastating for the Black community. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Ken.
I just want to add just a couple of kind of like global, stats to just support what was just said, because I think that was just such an excellent, look at what is happening, not only in this community, but in communities across the country. Just to say that, nearly 20 million homes still lack access to high-speed internet. And obviously that's a majority lower income folks, rural communities, Black folks. And, this isn't just a problem in the United States either. I think it's important to note that, only 1 in 3 students around the world today is able to participate in distance learning online. 1 in 3 around the world, globally. So just to put that in that context, and under neoliberalism, under these forms of capitalism, we will always scrap for little bits of infrastructure, little bits of from the state. We will always scrap. And so that, to me, part of the goal for now is to go ahead and scrap, but for later is to really transform the conditions that transform the structures that make it possible for us to get what we need. And right now, those structures are making it impossible. There was just a big campaign in Baltimore led by the students, to demand of their city council and of their and of other officials, their mayor, to make an investment, in students being able to have distance learning. So in cities across the country, people are taking action, and a lot of those people that are taking action are the students themselves. So I just wanted to lift that up.
Thank you for that, Malkia. So we're gonna go to our final question, and it's from Tiger. It's specifically to Malkia, but I will ask this for anybody. In what ways would you suggest we should organize our community in order to better strengthen it economically and socially? So I'll start with Malkia, and then if anyone else wants to answer that as well.
Well, that is a big question too. And I will find that link also too. I won't do it right now because I'm gonna answer this question first. But let me answer the question in a couple of ways. Let me answer one by saying that my mother always told me you need a plan for now and a plan for later, and the plan for now involves surviving this moment. That's the plan for now. What survival looks like is trying to pass COVID relief bills. What survival looks like is, as I mentioned earlier, strengthening mutual aid efforts. What survival looks like is finding ways to make these interventions for our children's education. Right? There are political steps, there are community-led steps, but this right now, this is about survival. I'm training right now to be an election defender, so that I can go out and I'm going to go to Walnut Creek, which is an area near where I live. Well, not near, but near enough to where I live. And that's where more wealthy people live. And we know that, you know, because of the way polling districts are, it'll include some poor people and some wealthy people in the same polling district. So I'm going there to make sure that Black people and other people who want to vote are not deterred from voting in those more conservative communities. So we have to defend the election, and not the election, but the voting process. You know, so that to me is like, how do we survive right now? And then there's the question of how do we what's our plan for later? You know, so I think that largely depends on. I think it depends in part on what happens with the not just the presidential elections, but congressional races and other races that are taking place right now. I think that it depends on whether or not, you know, this Supreme Court justice is confirmed. I think it depends on, you know, whether or not the Republicans continue to hold the Senate. Like, there are some political things that it depends on, but regardless of what happens next, regardless of whether Biden-Harris is the winner, or regardless of whatever, we know that there's three things that we have to do. One, we have to press the state for relief, and also we need to take more control over the state. So we need to run races. We need to run, just like we got Carol Ammons in there, we need to run races all over this country so that we have the kind of political power that is required to make moves. But also, we need to strengthen community organizations. We need to fund local organizing, because right now in this country, we don't know nothing about what a building a base really looks like. We ain't seen base building in this country for at least 50 years. We think that when we got 20 people showing up at a meeting, we like, yes, no, you know, we need thousands of people showing up at our meetings. We need the kind of infrastructure that can support democratic decision-making at mass scale, you know, in these types of organizations. So really figuring out how to invest in organizations that allow for consensus building, that allow for education, that allow for that type of organizing. And I think that lastly, we need to deal with the corporate ownership of everything, right? We gonna need to deal with that at the local level, but I would say that these corporations, they're transnational corporations. They're they're transnational corporations, and so we need real antitrust legislation. You know, we need to break these companies up. We need to tear them down. You know, they need to not be able, and also they need to be restrained. Like, some people are like, reform is stupid, and I'm all about revolution. But I'm like, you know, all reforms are not the same. They're not all created equal. You know, there are revolutionary reforms, like land reform in Brazil. You know, there are steps that one takes to achieve revolutionary change, right? Anyway, so we need to be on that strategy. What are the revolutionary reforms that we need to pass in order to meet our destination, in order to get there? And so that's some of what I think, you know, real recovery bill, you know, in terms of our issues, you know, I also think we need to diversify the highest levels in the newsrooms. You know, these newsrooms are 83% white. You know, at the highest levels, they're even the racial dynamic is even worse than that. And so we need to diversify these newsrooms. I mean, there's so many directions we need to go in. I can't really speak to all of them, but I will say that if we strengthen organizing, if we contest for power at the state level, and if we break down these corporations, then we have a shot at fighting and defeating fascism in this country. Because I will say in closing that Donald Trump not winning the election will not, even if he loses the election, fascism is still on the rise. It's not just here in this country, it's globally. You know, the spark has been lit. You know, the flame is going. So our efforts need to be the same in terms of redoubling up on fighting fascism, and that's what I think it'll take to get us there.
Is there anyone else that wanted to answer that question?
I will, Carol.
Well, you go ahead, James. I'll wait till last.
I want to echo a couple things that Malkia said. I think if we look at corporate power, I think we particularly need to look at big tech media power. We need to look at the fact that in this pandemic, in this crisis, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, all these people have made billions of dollars off of this. And not only are they making more money, but they're growing the capacity of their technology to gather our data and to surveil our lives and control our lives. And all of the things that are happening in education with, the Zoomification of universities. This is part of the pandemic, but it's also part of a way of restructuring universities and of demobilizing faculty and putting all this technology as driving university education. So, for example, we have university professors. My wife is one. She's sitting here and recording all of her lectures, and because it's a Zoom session, but nobody's telling her who owns those lectures. What's going to happen to them next year or the year after if she's not there? Who owns them and who's going to make money off of them? So we're not really thinking about this. Jeff Bezos and company are thinking about this every waking minute of their lives. How can they use this crisis, this moment, to expand their power and grow their wealth with their technology? So I think we need to be using our imagination to think about what they might be thinking and think about how we might develop our own power to develop alternative technologies and alternative centers, community-based technologies that are able to fulfill at least some of what these big tech companies are doing at the moment. And just the other point I want to make very briefly that Malkia has highlighted is we need a global awareness. As I said, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, we knew what was going on in other parts of the world. We didn't have the internet. We had newspapers. We had 3 TV channels, but we still knew what was going on in other parts of the world. And although we have 10,000 times as much information now, we know less about what's going on in other parts of the world than we did back then. Who can tell me what's happening with social movements in India, where there's all kinds of things happening, or Brazil, or in Europe? We're completely blocked from that information, and we're chasing stuff on Twitter and TikTok instead.
And I will just take the baton that James just passed to me. This is one of the things I said to Tatiana on my way from East St. Louis today. I said, if I pass a bill that restores 80,000 people's driver's license, a couple people like it. If I put up what I had for dinner, hundreds of people like that. This is what their capitalist controlled media has done to education, to civic engagement. It's turned it into 10 seconds, 6 seconds, unimportant BS. That's what they've done to it. And they're making billions of dollars off of the ignorance of the people. I read a lot of books, and there's several books that I keep with me all the time. Rethinking Humanity, Belden Fields. I want Belden Fields to know that that book stays with me. I wrote a resolution to the United Nations this year with Sundiata Chajua and Dr. Lou Turner. We wrote a resolution calling on the United Nations, like they did in the 60s, Malkia. We charged genocide because of the murder and killing of Black people wholesale at the hands of the state in the United States. And the Congress has slept and decided not to act. And so we wrote a resolution calling the United Nations in to engage around this issue to bring the United States under the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. That is because people on this call have been so influential into my own education. So I took that from the work that Belden Fields did in his book. I'm reading Democracy in Chains. Malkia just talked about this. It's upside down here. Democracy in Chains. This book tells us how for 50 years, the right and the libertarians have been working to do exactly what we are doing and facing fascism right now at this very moment. I have Dr. Claude Anderson's book, Powernomics, Why Black Folks Are Poor, Black Labor, White Wealth. We understand that these are not just instances of individualism. These are systems that are designed to produce certain outcomes. And the fact that this local newspaper have written more articles about me and a mistake at a little store than they have written on the billionaires taking money from the people during COVID-19. They've written more articles about me on some BS than they have written on Carl Hospital not paying a single bit of their taxes. That tells us how contrived this system is for those of us who are awoke. So, since this is the end, I think it would be more than appropriate for us to commit ourselves to the transformation that Malkia said is necessary for us in the next few years. What we will be facing either is a dictatorship in the United States and in the world community like none we've ever seen before, where the mass incarceration will explode even greater because we see greater poverty on the horizon because of what they're doing. If we don't do something to stop the corporatization of education, we will see more and more people who are ill prepared for the world that we are emerging into. And I'm talking about at younger ages. In Illinois, 8th graders, 86% of Black students literally leave 8th grade not having passed basic math. And I said to the Illinois State Board of Education, we should defund you completely. How could that be acceptable that 86% of Black students leave Illinois schools from 8th grade to 9th grade and they are not prepared with basic math? What a shame it is that we have systems that find that to be acceptable. So for us, it just requires us to do more. And as Malkia said, we need a mass movement to disrupt this crap because we have way too many people that accept it as if it is real and as if it is normal. And so I appreciate the work of the IMC. I hope that we will see another 20 years of the IMC and that the IMC will step up into the leadership role that it needs to be in to support people like myself and James and all of us on this call who are trying to hold the system folks accountable. And I look forward to it.
Thank you so much for that, Carol. We are running low on time and I want to respect everybody's time, but I do want to kind of throw out the question that Danielle Chenoweth had, and she said, we worked for decades to expand community voices and venues only to see our work lapsed by the work of the radical right. What do you see in the next 4 years as our point of leverage going forward to expand and scale up community media to the voices of love and can drown out the hate? So if there's anybody that wants to answer that as we kind of segue ourselves down to the end of the program.
I'll just say a couple of things here, which is, you know, there are some bills that have, you know, been that are on the table that I think moving them forward would help. The Moving Forward Act, the COVID recovery bill that put $80 billion into broadband infrastructure renewal. It was passed by the House. It needs to be passed by the Senate. There's the Rural Broadband Acceleration Act. It added $20 billion in funding. Again, moved by the House, not moved by the Senate. You know, there's a bunch of state bills, you know, that we can look to, but we need to expand the digital infrastructure that we have for community voice. And a lot of the old mechanisms for independent voices, they are being digitized. And so being able to make sure that we have access to high-speed broadband it's essential even to running your radio station, you know, to like all of these, you know, to running your community newspaper. I mean, they're online, you know what I'm saying? Like everything that we're trying to do at this point in time requires some ability to access high-speed internet. I think that, you know, there's a bill in terms of thinking about criminal justice, you know, in our voices. There's a bill called the algorithmic, I think it's called Algorithmic Injustice something bill. I don't know the third part of it, but I think passing that also would give us an opportunity it would create some leverage for our police tech, you know, fights, you know, our fights against electronic monitoring, our fights against risk assessment, you know, having some level of regulation in the AI space, because I don't believe we should be regulating the tech at all. I think that we should be abolishing and banning the tech. But in order to do that, some type of constraint, some rules that constrain the growth of automation in general is very important. And the last thing that I'll say is, you know, in terms of like what we need, I tried to answer, Daniel, I tried to answer your question a little bit in the last question, because I wasn't sure we was going to get to it. So I'll leave it at that. I think that, you know, there's some, like I said, some federal bills, some state work. I think at the local level, we need to keep doing what we're doing. You know, I don't think there's really any change. You know, I'm a person who always thinks in threes. And so I'm like, you know, fight for relief, fight for reparations, and fight for these revolutionary reforms that will get us to where we're going. And I think if we use that equation, that we will survive this.
Thank you, Malkia. Is there anybody else that wanted to answer that question as well?
I think I was just trying to do the same thing, but I think something Danielle just reminded me, October 9th, the remembrance of Kiwan Carrington. And no, we have not gotten justice, and we haven't gotten the truth. And one of the things that I have been trying to do is to get Kiwan Carrington listed on the national database as having been killed by the police. That is important. He is not listed there. And the city of Champaign knows that they've never, ever revealed the actual truth and held anyone accountable for his killing. 2, the collective bargaining contracts that the cities negotiate with the police unions need to be brought into alignment with the citizens. They have given them too much power over us, and now they are utilizing that power to diminish our democracy and diminish our rights. And so I introduced a bill to literally remove out of collective bargaining the ability for them to be protected from misconduct and charges when they are committing murder in the streets. And that's not a popular thing to do. And so if you want to help with that, I will certainly welcome it. And then lastly, as Malkia said, we do it in threes. It is important that we recognize those who have done harm to our community, like Kiwan. I learned a week ago that former Chief Finney, who was in that backyard when Kiwan was killed, has reinvented himself as a trainer at Western Illinois University. It is my hope that people on this call will join me in calling Western University of Illinois into account for hiring a person who has been involved in the killing and the cover-up of the person who actually killed Kiwan Carrington, and no accountability has taken place for his murder. And that will never go away until that is solved. And so we have to hold the system accountable as long as the system refuses to recognize the rights of people of color in this country, and those who are our allies must help us hold the system accountable. So that's my answer to you, Danielle. And I hope that you all will take seriously my call. My intention is to get him removed from Western Illinois University. He should not be paid by the taxpayers, as he was a party to the murder of an innocent 15-year-old boy in the backyard of a place that he had slept earlier that day. And so it is our duty to respond to that and to intervene. So with that, thank you all so much. Thank you, Malkia. It's so good to see you. So good to see you.
Great
and
to see
all
you.
the folks on the call.
Thank
you.
you. Y'all are brilliant.
I want to thank everybody for joining us for our second panel for the 20th anniversary of IMC. As you can tell, IMC has done such amazing work in our community and have partnered with such amazing people. Thank you, Malkia, Carol, and James for joining us today. I appreciate you guys and all the insight, and I'm grateful to the IMC that I'm able to meet and learn from such amazing activists in the community. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully I will see everyone soon. Everybody stay safe in these times.